Hey everyone, if you're here to talk about some punctuation, you are in the right place. Specifically, punctuation internationalization. So, I'm Nova Patch, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the Director of Internationalization and Localization for Shutterstock, an international marketplace for licensed images, videos, and music, where we support 21 languages. But I know at the Internationalization Unicode conference, that itself might not be very impressive. And everyone's like, but how many locales do you support? So we support 270 locales. Our strategy is to dynamically leverage Unicode and the CLDR to provide unique micro experiences localized for as many users as we possibly can, even when we only commit to, say, 21 translation languages. Well, there is always ways we can improve small aspects of our user experience, many of which just come down to punctuation. So today, we're going to just take a dive into one very specific aspect of internationalization, and that is punctuation. Well, you may have been heard that millennials are killing punctuation. But I've got good news for you, because punctuation's not dead. Yet, anyway. According to the Unicode standard, we have 788 punctuation characters and more being released every year. But, that's a lot of tofu. Fortunately, I'm vegan, so I can't get enough of this stuff. But hey, font designers, time to catch up. So let's take some tofu and make some tofu scramble. The CLDR provides a lot of great recipes for working with punctuation, and also data you can use to implement all sorts of features that you may not even realize need a special touch to localize. So each locale has a specified set of characters associated with what are alphanumeric, or what are alphabetic, what are numeric, and yes, what are punctuation. Here's an example of the exemplar characters for English punctuation. No surprises here. Various dashes, quote characters, so on and so forth, things that you might commonly see in English usage. Flipping over to another locale, such as French, and some minor differences. Remove a couple characters, add the guillemets, excuse my French. But it gets much more radically different when you jump over to Japanese. A lot more characters added here, some we never see in the Western world. And even variations of characters like the half-width and the full-width forms. So, this is all of interest to the linguist, but what can I do with these? And there are a few ways that I leverage even the CLDR data without necessarily implementing a programming solution with it, such as we need to support all of these characters for all of our official languages and locales. But as we've seen on the previous screen, some fonts just aren't up to the task. And with a company that's producing so many different websites and apps, you could easily end up in a situation where a font chosen doesn't support everything that's needed, and it's not necessarily all tested. So that's why we take the CLDR data and export the exemplar characters for use by our UX platform department and our QA department so that they make sure when making font decisions and with testing apps to view all of the characters that our users would potentially enter into the system or that we'd potentially display to users via translations or dynamic formatting. Other uses are making sure that you fully support the input on forms or even detection of language via search fields. Far too often, validation on forms is overly restrictive, and it's overly restrictive with very Western or oftentimes US English ideas on what are valid characters. So it is very important to make sure to accept all of the diversity of characters that your users may use worldwide. And this doesn't just go for official languages or locales that your systems may support, because users are free to use the system even when we don't communicate directly with them in their desired language or locale. And that even means a lot of characters that you might not expect. I know in the case of Shutterstock, we support tools to collaborate with other users and to design using our content. Well, we may not speak to them in Arabic, but we need to make sure that all of the characters that an Arabic language user would enter will go end to end in our system and be displayed to them appropriately. So that's even a level of making sure you have different tiers of languages and are able to support tiers where we don't localize into them, but we have a large user base that uses them. And the CLDR data has really helped out with that to make sure that systems work with all of the appropriate tiers of locales that should be supported. But those exemplar characters for punctuation have a little bit less programmatic use with us. So we'll go into some examples of implementation for different sets of punctuation. There are other sets like numbers. Well, what you see on the screen might not strictly be numbers themselves, but it's all of the characters commonly used in displaying numbers. We have plus and minus signs, we have comma and period and percent signs, all of which are used in input and output of different types of numbers, whether it's using thousand separators, decimal separators, or percents. And this can be really useful when validating input from users and, of course, formatting things appropriately for them. Fortunately, we've got a lot of very stable libraries now for implementing number formatting based on the CLDR. So in the past, I've gone and implemented libraries, say, in Perl to format numbers using CLDR data. Well, nowadays, you don't typically have to write your own library for that because, as we'll see, there are a lot of great, mature ones out there in many programming languages. And not just for overall formatting of numbers, but sometimes just specific uses of punctuation, such as the ellipsis. Say that you are truncating a string and you need a character to represent the fact that, well, the full string is not on the screen. That is not universal. We can't just hard code the ellipsis character, and that requires the attention to localization detail that we can leverage the CLDR for. However, this is an example where there are just less software libraries that support this, and In some cases, depending on what systems you're using, what programming language, what libraries are available, what browsers you have to support, you may have to implement in-house solutions leveraging the CLDR data itself, which is available via XML and JSON. And another example is the question mark as used commonly for more information. Many of us have seen question mark icons or even just text that is a question mark. Well, that itself is not global. And that's why I always advocate that using plain text for the question mark, or even if it looks like an icon but is actually overlaid with plain text, is a more localizable solution. Because take English and many languages of the world, yes, this is what we'd use. There can be some slight variation when you get into full-width characters, such as used in Chinese, but that's not necessarily the best example to show why we should implement punctuation localization, because realistically, you can use either of these and users will know what it is. But what about Arabic and other right-to-left languages? Well, you flip the question mark the other way. And this is one of the stronger examples for why we should support dynamic localization of punctuation, including even in more information symbols. And Greek uses a radically different character altogether than the question mark. Then there are quotation marks. Where would we use these? Let's see. Left and right quotation mark. Now, a lot of the times this would be within text, and we wouldn't necessarily have to dynamically localize it. Instead, the linguists will take care of it. They know their language better than us programmers will be able to do. There's so much nuisance in nuance. Nuisance and nuance in natural language. But there are some elements in apps where you might want to dynamically localize them, such as dynamic quoting. Say we are featuring quotes on a asset detail page for selling some sort of item, and you want to place quotes around what customers said. Or even say you've got a page where you're featuring a number of quotes from partners, and you want to either just place these characters around your text, or maybe even you have special design or markup elements where it makes them larger or in different colors. And by default, I think most people would just hard code the left and right quotes, but that just wouldn't work for all of our users. Because as we've seen, the French version, yes, they would be able to understand the English version because it's in such widespread use. But it doesn't add that certain level of localized detail that users really appreciate. And I've seen that just delighting users with the small things, whether they can comprehend the non-localized version or not, does not matter. What matters is that you continue to delight users and provide a fully end-to-end localized user journey, because that can sometimes be the difference between whether they want to use your system or a competitor's system. Japanese, yet different quotation characters. And what I like is that for so much of this, you don't have to make the case that original research is needed or that spend is needed on figuring out which ones to use. The CLDR just provides it for you. And even gets into the level of detail for like alternate forms, such as left and right single quotes, which many languages have alternate forms as well. Then what about formatting lists? Say, apples, bananas, and oranges. and you want commas between them. This is yet another case where by default, most programmers, myself included in the past, because I come from, I'm working more on the product side nowadays, but 15 years of my career was on engineering, and I was implementing a lot of this stuff, which has been very useful now for working from the product perspective. So, commas, delimiting lists. I've hard-coded them too when generating, but nowadays we really have to leverage the tools available to us to properly localize these. And we'll see that there's different usage both in the commas and, of course, if you're saying and or between the last element. And fortunately, the CLDR supports that. Modern libraries like Intel on ECMAScript and ICU support that. And if your system does not support one of those libraries, well, the raw data is also available and pretty easy to implement. I know because I've implemented the Perl CPAN module to supply this functionality. Other thing, the compound unit for short unit lengths. Think even in Shutterstock usage. We have a plan for 750 images per month. And if you needed a short form of that, such as for a mobile device, and you just wanted 750 images/month to designate images per month, well, here is the punctuation with all sorts of locale data to implement that. And then if we jump back into numbers, well, there is so much diversity in the punctuation used within numbers. Sure, a number of locales use the period as the decimal symbol, but, well, many of them use a comma, and there's even diversity within languages, such as Spanish, where we typically use the period in Latin American Spanish, but the comma as the decimal separator in European Spanish. And yeah, that can get confusing because the comma is the 1,000 grouping separator in English, as well as in Latin American Spanish. Fortunately, when it comes to number formatting, as I mentioned before, this is where consistently a lot of these libraries, including many open source libraries, have the most mature implementations of CLDR formatting. And this is not just for output, but also for input, because you can't expect your users to input data and do their own conversion into whatever, say, maybe your US English expectations are. And that sometimes even involves loose matching, where you might accept a variety of different characters because users get confused. Should I enter it in my way? Should I enter it in their way? Plus sign, percent sign. Percent's another one that far too often this is just hard-coded. You take a number, you concatenate a percent sign at the end. Well, that doesn't work for everyone because, yes, it works for English, and I'm not meaning to say English is 99% here because it is not. But you flip over to French, and, well, you should have that non-breaking space. Most French punctuation uses a space between the number or word and the punctuation character. And note, I say punctuation a little liberally here. If we want to talk strictly about punctuation, linguistically, I extend that usage more to various non-alphanumeric symbols that are used in written text. Not to state that it is formal punctuation, but from an engineering standpoint, a lot of the nuances of punctuation and other non-alphanumeric symbols that we see in text and in formatted values are handled in similar ways. jump over to Turkish, and we plop that % on the other side of the number, and you quickly see how hard-coding concatenated % onto numbers falls apart. Yet, it continues to be the most common oversight I see in implementations of %. Fortunately, in libraries across the board, it's very easy to implement localized formatting here. So let's jump into a few of those libraries. There's the old traditional ICU, Internationalization Components for Unicode. And it's available in C and Java, ICU for C and ICU for Java. Now, I don't traditionally work in C or Java. I traditionally work in a variety of languages that some might call scripting languages. I've already mentioned Perl. That was what I used throughout much of my early career. And of course, JavaScript and a number of other languages out there as well. And many of these have not had good support for ICU. And that's meant that earlier on, I've had to implement a lot of solutions using the raw CLDR data. However, I'm happy to say that the times are changing, and many languages and their standard libraries or their package repositories are really catching up with the modern needs for internationalization. One of them is localized.js. I've used this a lot in JavaScript projects and also contributed directly to it. It's a great library that I'd say was the earliest sort of mature CLDR implementation on the scene in the JavaScript world. And it provides all sorts of formatting for dates, times, numbers, %, currencies. And note, when it comes to prices and currencies, this is even of interest to English-only companies. Because if we were to jump back to the screen of the 270 locales that Shutterstock supports, well, you would see that over 50 of them are English locales. And English remains a very important language. If we had no other language supported, but just supported those 50 plus English locales, that would provide a certain level of localized support to our users within a monolanguage, especially of concern to prices and currencies, because it's so important to understand what price you're being marketed, what price you're making a transaction in. And say you're a company that only supports US dollars. So you're just not there yet with internationalization in the currency perspective. Well, you really need to make sure that the French or Canadian and Australian and other countries that use the dollar sign for their currency is unambiguous. So that's where we even leverage CLDR-based libraries like Localize for our English users, because then clearly you have US dollar sign in these other countries where it would be ambiguous. Now, the Intel standard for ECMAScript, as implemented in JavaScript, is newer on the scenes than Globalize, but it's quickly catching up. And in some cases, it is surpassing the functionality of Globalize, such as with the list localization. So using the commas or whatever the associated punctuation character is in your language. Well, being able to format those lists. And that's been really useful for some of my projects as well. I go with a hybrid approach of using Globalize where it's appropriate and using Intel where it's appropriate. Note, though, that when you are using a JavaScript standard, you need to make sure that the systems you're using all support the appropriate version of it, as opposed to Globalize where you can just load up the version that you need and the locales that you need. And then there are also very specific libraries. This one isn't even CLDR based. It's libphonenumber from Google, as used for Android, and available in, for formatting numbers on Android, and available in Java, C++, and JavaScript because, well, phone numbers include punctuation as well, and those aren't standardized in the Unicode CLDR. But there's this great library out there that can help us consistently format phone numbers for our users in all of their locales. As I've mentioned, you can also leverage the CLDR data itself because sometimes there just isn't a solution in your programming language. Sometimes I've found that something's been very recently standardized in the CLDR and it just hasn't been implemented yet. Other times we just might be forced to use systems that don't have an ideal library, and then we might have to dig into the data. Other times we might have special use cases like generating all of the characters that we need to support for our UX platform team, as I mentioned earlier, so that they can make sure that all the fonts we're going to use support that, because we don't want our apps to look like ransom notes with all different fonts used for different characters within the same strings of text. And etc. I know that's repetitive, but as I mentioned, the Perl world, well, who knows what language you have on whatever systems that have some sort of internationalization requirements. I've found that I had to just go out and implement CPAN modules. So a few of them out there like CLDR number and CLDR list are ones that I've implemented just as very specific chunks of what might be needed in your software solutions. But not everything is standardized yet, and there is opportunity for additional standardization. Take the colon. So commonly, we have this design pattern where we have, say, form fields, and there's a form label, colon, and then a field. Or maybe we're displaying an account detail page where we display all of the data for a user. By default, without having a system to consistently localize that colon, whether that should be, say, a full width colon, or whether there should be a non-breaking space between the label and the colon, as would be used in French. So short of having a standardized system for that, I always just recommend send it for translation to the linguists. So if you have name colon, this goes against the tendency of many engineers I've worked with. They might want to make a system that doesn't repeat itself so much, but oftentimes the linguists know best. So by default, I say send that name colon, send that address colon for translation. But ideally, build the architecture so you can dynamically localize this. Yes, we don't have it standardized in the CLDR yet, but there is some data that can be leveraged in the CLDR, such as for creating locale names, and digging into the XML or the JSON can show it to you. But this is also something that if you already have a team of linguists that you send translations to, you could request feedback from them and then implement this so that you can consistently support labels with colons. Other ones are parens. This is another one where there is some useful data sort of buried into the XML or JSON CLDR data, but not really the standards around usage yet. And where would you want to use these significantly throughout your user experience? And one of them is, say you've got a set of something, whether it's in Shutterstock, we might have collections of images. And a collection of images would have a name, such as Happy Bunnies. I've got my collection of Happy Bunny photos. Well, I've got 34 photos in it. So I may have the name of it, Happy Bunnies, I open paren 34, close paren, to show how many are in my collection. And you'll see that pattern used so frequently that it would be best if we had a standardized solution in the CLDR for usage. And it's something to think about when you're implementing that pattern, because there is some available data on this. And if you already are working with translation systems, you could potentially build this using your style for each language. Other ones are the multiplication sign. So take another Shutterstock example. We've got image dimensions. It's 300 pixels by 600 pixels, or however many centimeters by however many centimeters. And you see this a lot in product information, whether it is a physical size of a product or whether it is the digital size of a product in various units of measure. The CLDR provides those units of measure for formatting. We can format centimeters, we can format inches, we can format all sorts of esoteric units of measure. But there's no standard for saying, 5 centimeters by 10 centimeters. And this is something where we've just developed internal patterns for supporting this. Some companies commonly use, at least on the English side, an X instead of the multiplication sign for this pattern. And I've found with working with a team of international linguists that not all languages are very open to using that X instead of the multiplication sign. So this is even another level of detail to pay attention to and to make sure that your systems localize and has opportunity for improved standardization in the future. Then, what are a few different ways we can work with punctuation? I've mentioned some of these already, but this is an overview here. For input and output of user data, so first step is the validation. We need to accept the real data from our users. And one of the biggest historic problems I've experienced entering data is what is deemed as invalid characters. And in most cases, when you receive a message saying that your characters are invalid, well, they're actually valid for you, and it's just overly restrictive rules. So whenever there are validation rules being defined, I always push back on why are we being so overly restrictive, and if you need a case to be less restrictive, the CLDR provides a lot of great example characters that might be commonly found in a language. Then parsing, such as natural language parsing or any sorts of form fields where you might expect a number or a percent. And there are some libraries as well as CLDR standards on loose parsing of input, where you might receive a variety of different all valid formats. Sometimes it's important to perform normalization on your input because, well, you could have a half width or a full width period. And instead of just saying we only support one format or the other, it's why not support both formats? We're designing systems for our users, not designing our users for systems. Comparison is really in the same boat. Say you are comparing two values. Normalization is so important for this. Not all characters that could potentially be used by users are covered by Unicode normalization, though. You might have, say, a formal minus signed character versus the hyphen minus versus various other forms of dash that, depending on how you're using things, you might just want to consider all of them to be equivalent. And One thing that I like to occasionally do is report on what users are entering and what's failing. This can be really useful for improving your system using data-based approaches. So, say if you're logging, for example, all search queries, and you're also logging if those search queries returned no results. Sometimes you can find patterns looking at past failure data. And I've found in various cases in the past that some form of punctuation was used, and we just weren't expecting it. So the solution isn't to then add a message telling users not to use that. The solution is just to start looking for that punctuation and supporting it. Then, of course, output formatting. This is the easiest one to support. As I said, we have many mature libraries, whether you're using ICU, Globalize, Intel, or various other ones out there, or micro implementations of different things on NPM. But note, with some of these small implementations, even ones that I've created in the Perl world in the past, some of them aren't maintained very well. So that's also important to make sure that libraries are being maintained, because if you're working on systems with so many layers like I am, so many backend services, so many different front-end platforms, you may be using a variety of different libraries, and if you stick to the ones that are well maintained and that you can upgrade the versions, you can have a more consistent experience end to end, because it can be confusing if you support some locales somewhere, other locales other places, and the end result is maybe your punctuation is different for users in the Spanish experience, where it's a mix between Latin American and European Spanish. You don't want that. Rendering really same case as formatting. So, to localize or not to localize? As much as I've talked about not hard coding punctuation, there are some clear cases for hard coding. It's really when punctuation, or symbols in general, are not used linguistically. They're not part of our language text, but instead part of design components. Take HTML page titles. Commonly, you will see titles in the form of title name, space, pipe, space, company name, such as Shutterstock. And that pipe really isn't punctuation. It's really not linguistic data. It is just part of the overall design of the page in a plain text format. Similarly, breadcrumbs for navigating through a site. They might use the greater than sign, and that's not really part of the language. Now, there are some caveats to this. Typically, those things are okay to hard code, but in some cases, they do need to be flipped, such as for right to left user interfaces. But they don't typically need that level of detail for supporting different formats in all of the different languages and locales that you might support. So, say using a pipe sign in HTML headers, perfectly fine to hard code that somewhere. Ideally, it's not hard coded on every single page, but instead controlled from a central location if, for whatever reason, your site chooses to change it in the future. Because I have received a lot of translation strings that include that in it. And I'm like, oh, no, don't send that in the translation string. We don't want the linguists to be attempting to do anything with it. And it makes it that much harder to universally change in the future if you do want to change it for your global style. Then there's in the translation text itself, which really, if you're using punctuation within text for translation or immediately bordering it, saying you know that there are quotes used around this text from day one, that's just part of your string of text, well, by all means, just send it on to the linguists. They know the nuances of their language the best. They can provide the best formatting for it. They can put the right spaces in there if needed. It's only when we really have things that are truly dynamic in nature. We're formatting dynamic values, or we just are interpolating any strings between our quote signs, or just as one of many examples. That's when dynamic formatting, leveraging the CLDR, or even entirely different systems like libphone number, has its best strength. But I say this to mention that hard coding, translating, and dynamically formatting are all great solutions for different use cases. So, given everything I've said, one thing that comes up every once in a while with me is that in the case of Shutterstock, we have brand guidelines. And these brand guidelines include not just aspects of imagery and color and how we say things, but also the punctuation and various style guide related things that we support. And sometimes I get pushback on our various local formats because they're not in the brand guidelines. The brand guidelines clearly say one thing, and then they're like, wait, the Spanish site isn't using our brand guidelines. And many companies choose their internal style or their brand guidelines based on common style guides, AP, or what's close to my heart personally, Chicago. But what is important to note is that these are all English specific. AP, Chicago, whatever style guide it is, or your company's style guide or brand guidelines are likely English specific. And most of it is globally relevant, but we can't apply English specific rules to all of our many languages and locales. And there's a good case for pushing back on that. I'm sure I'm not the only person who has received feedback on that. That is why we, by default, when it's not on the English side or not on a language-specific brand guidelines, if you're a more global company and do have that, by default, just leveraging the Unicode standard and the Unicode CLDR, which are very mature when it comes to the mainstream, most popular locales out there. So much so that when we developed style guides for all of our languages, we seeded them with the Unicode CLDR data. So for all of the appropriate punctuation and currency symbols to use, we were like, let's just auto-generate this based on the CLDR and say, by default, we want to use what the CLDR does so that we can have a consistent experience among all of our localized formatting, the various CLDR-based libraries, and our translations, because many of the punctuation characters will be in translations themselves, and there's not always one way to do it. Take English, for example. Whether you're a fan of the serial comma or not, most companies have one format that they say you should use. Or phone numbers. Do you use the parens around the area code? Do you use periods in it? Any of them are fine if that's what the company standard is, but it might not be applicable to other languages. And other languages may have multiple different versions in common use, but you want to standardize on one version. Well, I've successfully made the case for CLDR by default just because it makes life easier, and so many resources and vetting have already gone into the CLDR locale data. So then we take that and we build our design components. The components we would use for building, say, a JavaScript or React-based application, where the developer then who is implementing new features, in most cases, doesn't even have to think about the internationalization aspect. Instead, can use design components that may provide the more info icon or the quotes needed around featuring a quote. And it requires just less thought for every single implementation because our internal building blocks already support this aspect of localization. So, we've talked a lot about characters, or a lot about punctuation. There's always a lot more we can talk about punctuation, but we are limited in time here. So, thank you for diving into punctuation with me, and we are going to have some time for questions and answers. You can also find me on Twitter @NovaPatch, or if you're feeling corporate, on LinkedIn, and I am happy to dive deeper into punctuation with you or any topics that you may be interested in talking about. Unfortunately, we can't all be together in person this year, but thank you so much for listening to my talk, and have a happy Halloween.